My name is Kelly, and I have an unhealthy obsession with serial killers.
This is Kelly, and this is King Size Killers and Bite Size Bits. Before we get started, I wanted to make a correction with something I said about Ted Bundy and one of the last murder victims. So one of the corrections I wanted to make about Bundy was Kimberly Leach. I said that as he was raping her, he strangled her, but he actually, while he was raping her, slit her throat. So that's how she passed, and I wanted to make sure I corrected that in case there was anybody out there going, what the fuck, you're totally wrong about that. So again, a lot of this is done off of just my long history of watching documentaries on these people and trying to get to know their crimes. So sometimes I do mess up a bit. Arthur Shawcross. Okay, the one thing I will say about this podcast is I want to warn you that there's some language and there are some details about a crime he committed, a couple crimes he committed that are a little graphic. I really didn't go into too much detail because when it involves children, I'm not comfortable with that. So, listen at your own discretion. He was a little different for me because I don't know if it was the interviews that I watched that kind of set me aside or just his demeanor, but he's just a swarmy piece of shit. And he was active in Rochester, New York, and he was also known as the Genesee River Killer. So he had, I think, around 14 victims, and he was active from 1972 to 1989. And his first known murders were in 1972, and he killed 2 children. And I think this is one of the things that bothers me the most is one little girl he abducted and he raped and strangled her, and he stuffed mud and dirt and leaves down her throat. And they don't know whether or not that was to keep her quiet or what, but he left this poor little girl, in a drain pipe. And it was, from listening to some of the detectives that worked the case, that was very difficult for them to handle, which I can imagine that. And then he also abducted a little boy, and he sodomized this little boy, and he mutilated him in ways that are I just don't care to vocalize. I mean, it was just disgusting. So he was sent to prison for that, and he only served 14 years of his 25-year sentence, and they let him out. And he, went on to kill prostitutes, which seems to be like the category of what a lot of these guys go for. And unfortunately, it is the way they live their life that kind of puts them in harm's way. And I'm certainly not faulting them for that. Everyone, does what they have to do to survive. And unfortunately for these people, that was it. And so he went on, and he was actually married twice, I think. And he, listening to his confessions, he talks about his time in Vietnam. He was a soldier in Vietnam, and he discusses how he was a weapons specialist in Vietnam, and how he encountered a couple of Vietnamese women and he said that they were approaching him in a threatening manner. So he captured them, and he took one of them and chopped her head off, and then started to fillet her legs over a fire in front of her friend or her acquaintance or whatever it was, trying to get out, some information. And so as they done some background on this guy, it's total BS. He was like a supply clerk. He never saw any sort of action. So that kind of set me off a little bit. I was like, okay. So he likes to think of himself in a different way, which I think is common for a lot of people, whether they admit it or not. And so he served out his time, and that was a story that he'll tell you. You watch any interview with him, he'll tell you about all of that, which turned out to be a fabrication. And so when he came back, and he started murdering these women, a lot of them were murdered in Monroe County, except for one, and she was murdered in a neighboring county of Wayne County. He kind of went around and this is, he strangled these women, and he would just dispose of their bodies and what have you, and go home and, lead a normal life. Anytime you watch an interview with him, he sits and he's very holier than thou is kind of like the only thing I could think of to describe him. But to me, he just was just little man who had absolutely no self-confidence. And they had him evaluated by a psychiatrist, and he came out with the fact that he was molested by his mother, that his mother would perform oral sex on him, and he actually, this psychiatrist testified at his trial, and his family came forward, and they were like, of course nobody's going to admit this for the most part, don't get me wrong, but they were like, this never happened. And then you'll hear other accounts of him, and he'll talk about an aunt supposedly did this to him, but the aunt's name that he gives, he doesn't even have an aunt with that name. So he just was I think what struck me about him was his lack of just, I don't want to say personality, but the bigger the story he told, the better he felt about himself, if that makes sense. He just, he was somebody that should never have been let out for the most part. He was somebody that should never have been let out of prison for killing those two children. And they had a lot of dispute about that, because you do to those two kids what he did. There's absolutely no reason that you should smell freedom at all. If anything, you should be introduced to a few people who don't like, pedophiles and child killers in prison, because that's what you deserve. He just never, and in the interviews, the only time he ever talked about the killing of the two kids is when he took the plea bargain. And that sent like an uproar, that they would actually do this, that they would actually take and give this man a plea bargain for what he had done. And so, he gets out and he ends up committing all of these horrific crimes. And, he just, I think he put the blame on everybody else, which I think is common for a lot of people who do wrongdoing. There's a very rare will you ever hear of anyone saying, yeah, I did that, I'm sorry. But he was just one of these that would throw anybody under the bus that he possibly could. And he even admitted that he felt no remorse whatsoever for killing anyone. And when the interviewers tried to ask him about the children, he stopped an interview because he didn't want to talk about it. So you have to see, there is some shame there, because he's sitting across from somebody who is living a normal life, having a normal job, doing normal things, wanting you to talk about something that is so horrific that nobody could ever articulate. Like, how do you fucking explain the fact that you kidnapped these two kids and you did these horrible things to them? And so as he was in prison, the one thing he did find out, that he had a daughter while he was over in Vietnam. He got around over there, and he had a daughter, and she found out who he was and contacted him. And I think this is where, like, I have such a problem with this. Now, I understand wanting to know about the other half of you. I will be honest. I don't know who my father is. Now, if I found out that he was a fucking serial killer, I don't know what I would do. Maybe I'd write a couple letters, kind of look him up on the internet, find out what he's done. Never would I introduce my children or my grandchildren to him. And this woman took her kids to meet him. And I think she's got like 6 kids. And so, like, the youngest, they don't know who he is. But the oldest one does, and goes and sees him. And, I guess you're not going to convince me that's okay. Everyone has their opinion. You do whatever makes you happy. But for me, the fact that he killed children would put a stop to that. He doesn't deserve any happiness in his life. He was never remorseful. He's even admitted that. He has no remorse. He's even said, there's just something wrong with him. We know that. But I don't really think that I can fully articulate how just set aside I was with this man. And unfortunately, he died too soon. He was only 63, and he died in 2008. And, he was given a sentence of, I think, like 250 years. Now that's punishment. Like, if you can get somebody to live 250 fucking years to write out their sentence, that'd be amazing. But, for me, he was a liar, which, but it was the reasons that he lied. Some of the serial killers that I've talked about they've had high IQs, and they've been narcissistic, and he was neither. And he wasn't narcissistic at all. He was a little man, and he had to tell stories to make himself feel a little better. I mean, I don't know. And unfortunately, his family had to endure the things that he had said about him. And they had to endure the fact that, they were associated with him. And he just, I don't know, there's just always a few things that you read about that kind of stick with you, and you really can't describe why, if that makes any sense whatsoever. But he's just one of those guys that was just like, I wouldn't feel sorry for him for anything that happened to him before or after he was imprisoned, because I think that there's just something just beyond disgusting with him. He died in prison in 2008 of cardiac arrest. Okay. And he was cremated. It doesn't say whether or not anybody ever came to get his body or anything like that. There's not much on his the only thing that really showed about his imprisonment is that his daughter and his granddaughter would come visit him, and there's pictures. And like I said, that just bothers me. It just bothers me. So he's been interviewed quite a few times, and there is one thing I will say is, like, in 2003 he was interviewed by a British reporter for a documentary on cannibalism, and Shawcross had bragged about slicing off and eating the vulva of 3 victims. He refused to discuss his earlier claims of eating the genitalia of his first victim, which was Jack Blake, which was the little boy. And the one thing that I will say, when he described eating the vulva of these women, or even the uterus, I believe, or in that area, he talked about it, and he just described it, and he was just like, have you ever had a raw piece of meat? No, we haven't had a raw piece of meat. But that's the way he talked about things. It was just kind of like, what, you've never done it? Doesn't sound good to you? And that's just like, he's just disgusting. He's just a piece of shit.